The casserole dish hit the marble floor, and before I could even breathe, my husband's voice cut through the silence. We need to talk about the divorce. 7 months pregnant, my mother buried just 3 weeks before, and standing right behind him was my best friend, the woman who held my hand at the funeral, the woman who had been sleeping with my husband for 14 months. He slid divorce papers across the counter and offered me a tiny studio apartment, $12,000 a month, from a man worth $800 million. He called me a nobody. He had no idea who my mother really was. This story is for every woman who has ever been underestimated, overlooked, or left behind by someone who was supposed to love her. Because the people who call you nothing are always the ones most terrified of what you're about to become. Stay with me because what happens next will show you that grace, silence, and patience are the most powerful weapons a woman will ever carry. If this story already feels familiar, hit that like button, drop a comment telling me who in your life underestimated you, and subscribe. Because every week I bring you stories about women who refuse to stay broken.
I can still hear that casserole dish hitting the floor. Behind me, Grant's voice was too steady. We need to talk about the divorce. The word just hung in the air. I remember standing there in our penthouse, barefoot, pregnant with you, and wearing my mother's old sweater. Her shrimp and grits, the last recipe she taught me, was a mess on the Italian marble. It had only been 3 weeks since we buried her. 3 weeks since I'd stood there while Grant checked his phone behind me. I'd told myself he was just bad at grieving. I see now how naive that was. When I turned, he was in the doorway, suit and all, with a look that meant a decision had been made without me. He slid a thick manila envelope onto the counter. The kind you know changes your life before you even open it. "It's better for both of us," he said. I looked at the envelope, the mess, and then at him, my husband of 23 months. He'd proposed on a Tuesday in his office. I once thought it was romantic, like he just couldn't wait. Now I see he just penciled me in. "Why?" I asked. My voice was so thin, I hated it. It felt as fragile as the broken dish. He ran a hand through his hair, a move I recognized. It was the same rehearsed gesture he used right before a big presentation. "We've grown apart, Vivian," he'd said. He needed someone who fits my world. "I'm your wife," I thought. "I'm carrying your child." He told me not to worry, that he'd already found me a place. A studio. A studio. That's when it hit me. This wasn't a conversation. It was an eviction. And suddenly, tiny details I'd pushed aside for months came rushing back. The perfume on his collar wasn't my vanilla. It was sharper. His phone buzzed, and he flipped it over, fast. "Is there someone else?" I asked. His jaw tightened, and his eyes flickered away for just a second. He said it wasn't about that, but his eyes had already told me everything. I'd spent 2 years learning that face. I knew when he was lying. I didn't beg, you know. I just got down on my knees and started picking up the pieces of the dish. It seemed fitting, really. My whole marriage shattered on the floor. I remember holding the shards, wondering if I could put them back together. And right then, you kicked me, hard, as if to say, "I'm still here." Grant watched for a moment, adjusted his tie, and said, "I'll give you the weekend to process, to pack." Then he just walked out. I heard his shoes click on the marble, the door close, and the lock turn. And just like that, I was alone in that big apartment that never once felt like home. I sat on that cold floor for a long time, holding a jagged piece of porcelain. I could smell the shrimp and butter mixing with the lavender candle I'd lit earlier for Mom. Lavender was her scent. Then my phone rang. It was Delaney Archer, my best friend from college, the woman who'd been my maid of honor, the one who sat with me when my mother's heart gave out. Her voice was so warm. "Hey, babe," she said. "How are you holding up? Want me to come over?" And for a second, I almost said yes. I almost let that word out like I had 1,000 times before. Yes, come over, bring wine, make this not be happening. That's what I wanted to say. But something held me back. It was her timing. The call came exactly 11 minutes after Grant left. It was too perfect, like she'd been waiting for a cue. Maybe, I said instead, I'll think about it. I hung up and put my hand on my stomach where you were wiggling around. It's you and me now, little one, I whispered. I couldn't have known it then, but answering that call would have been the final, cruelest cut. Morning came, of course. I hadn't slept. I'd found my way to your nursery and just sat. I'd painted that room myself and even built the crib watching a tutorial online. Grant had said he'd hire someone, but he never did. I sat in the flea market rocking chair, and its familiar creak was the only comfort. I just replayed his words, his gestures. 23 months, a Tuesday proposal. Who does that? A man checking a box, scheduling a wife between a meeting and his 4 o'clock tea time. On pure instinct, I dialed my mother's number. Her voicemail picked up. You've reached Eleanor. Leave something lovely. Oh, that voice. I hung up and called right back just to hear it one more time. Holding the phone to my chest, I felt a gentle kick from you, as if you were comforting me. And by 9 o'clock that morning, I'd made a decision. It wasn't one of those huge, life-altering decisions, you know. It was the kind a woman makes when her whole world has crumbled and she just needs to find a reason why. Grant's iPad was just sitting there on the counter. He'd either forgotten it, or more likely, he just never imagined I'd look. That was your grandfather's biggest mistake, darling. He always underestimated me. Our whole relationship was built on him thinking I was too sweet, too naive to ever question him. I knew his password, of course. Our anniversary, October 14th. How ironic. I typed it in, and the screen came to life. His messages were right there. And the name at the very top made my heart sink. Delaney. Not her full name, just Delaney, with a little red heart next to it. The kind of thing that takes time to build. My hands were perfectly still as I scrolled all the way to the beginning, but I couldn't seem to catch my breath. They started 14 months before, not just a few weeks. A full 14 months. Before our anniversary. Before I was pregnant with you. Before my own mother got sick. Before all of it. He had pet names for her. Baby D, my girl. They made plans for dinners, hotels, weekend wins away when he told me he was flying to Dallas for business. And there were pictures. Delaney posing in lingerie in his office. The one with that big view of the park. The same office where he'd asked me to marry him. I just kept scrolling, and each message was a fresh wound. There was one from her, sent the day of my mother's funeral, the day I was standing in that cold cemetery with my best friend's arm around me. How much longer do we have to pretend, she'd written. His reply came just 3 minutes later. Soon, he said. Let her grieve. Then we move. As if I was just a piece of furniture they had to pack up. As if my grief was just some temporary problem they had to put up with before they could finally throw me out with the trash. And you see, I knew. I wasn't going crazy. I knew something was wrong, the late nights, how he'd look away during dinner, the way he'd flinch if I reached for his phone, how he stopped saying my name, how Delaney, my best friend, always knew his schedule better than I did. Deep down, in that quiet place where your gut feelings live, I knew it all. I kept scrolling past all of it. The pictures, the secret names, the lies, and then I found the messages about you, my baby. It was Grant's words, right there in those little gray bubbles. She can have custody. I don't want the kid complicating things. Delaney's response was just an emoji, a laughing emoji. My best friend, talking about my unborn child, with a laughing emoji. My hands started shaking so badly the iPad slipped right out of them. I caught it against my belly, and right then, you gave a huge kick, right where the screen was pressed against me. It was like you already knew, like you were already in there, fighting for us. I locked the screen, then unlocked it. I did it again and again, locking it, unlocking it, as if the words might just shuffle themselves into something I could live with. As if one more look would reveal a different story, one where my husband loved me and my best friend wasn't a stranger. A story where that laughing emoji was about some silly joke. But the words never change, do they? They just stay there. So I called her. Not to scream at her. I wasn't ready for that. I just needed to hear her voice. I needed to see if it sounded different now that I knew the truth. "Hey, Viv," she said, so cheerful. "I was just thinking about you. You shouldn't be alone. Come stay with me. I'll make up the guest room. We can watch those awful movies you love." Every single word was a perfectly aimed little dagger. The fake concern, the warmth. It was all an act. A brilliant performance, really. "Maybe," I told her. "I'll think about it." The same thing I'd said the night before, but this time the words felt like a door slamming shut. After I hung up, I went to the bathroom, held onto the sink, and was sick. It wasn't morning sickness that had passed. This was my body physically rejecting the lies I'd been fed for so long. Truth sickness, I suppose. My body just couldn't hold that poison anymore. I rinsed my mouth and looked at myself. 30 years old, 7 months pregnant with you, with dark circles under my eyes, and my mother's old cardigan hanging off my shoulders. I didn't look like a woman whose world had just exploded. I just looked tired, like I'd been tired for a very long time, and was only just then realizing it. The worst part, you see, wasn't even the affair. It wasn't the hotels or the pictures. The worst message was about you. My baby. The little life inside me that I already loved more than anything in the world. A laughing emoji. That's all you were worth to them. I put my hands on my belly and felt you move, this warm, solid, miraculous little person. "I'm so sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry this is the world you're coming into." Then, I stood up straight, splashed my face with cold water, and dried my hands on a towel that still had his initials on it. I had things to do. That iPad, it turned out, had more secrets than I ever could have imagined. I spent that whole night reading. Not my usual novels, not the baby books piled by your crib. I read the digital record of my husband's betrayal. And what I found in those quiet, early morning hours changed everything. It was a folder in his email labeled Prenup Review. Inside were messages between Grant and his lawyer, a man named Douglas Keller. The messages started right after we got married. The lawyer, Douglas, had written, "Grant, the prenuptial agreement was never filed with the court. We have to fix this. It's unenforceable." And Grant's reply was just, "I'll handle it." 2 months later, another email from Douglas. "Grant, this is urgent. The prenup is still unfiled. Vivian would be entitled to equitable distribution." And Grant's reply? "She's a nobody. She won't fight. Drop it. She's a nobody. She won't fight." I read those words over and over. The first time, I was shocked. The second time, I recognized the truth of how he saw me. The third time, honey, it was like striking a match. Without that prenup, I was entitled to half of everything he had, $800 million. His lawyers had told him, twice, and he just ignored them. All because he thought I was a nobody who wouldn't fight. His arrogance, it turned out, was his biggest weakness. And in those weak spots, I was learning. That's where the truth likes to hide. There was more, too. A whole other email chain with his mother, Celeste. She never once asked me to call her by her first name, you know. That Christmas, she gave me a bathrobe with his initials on it. She always looked at me like I was a spill on her clean tablecloth. Delaney comes from the right family, she had written to Grant. This should have been the match from the beginning. End this quietly. And his response? I'm handling it. She'll take the studio and be grateful. Grateful, as if I should thank him for the honor of being thrown away. I closed the iPad and went to the nursery. I sat in that rocking chair and pulled our wedding album off the shelf. It was so heavy, bound in leather, the kind of thing that costs a fortune. It cost more than some people pay for rent. I opened it, and there we were, me and Delaney, back in our freshman dorm. The room was tiny, barely a closet. I remember we shoved our beds together that first week because she was so scared of thunderstorms. We'd made this promise one night, over some terrible cheap wine, that we'd be maids of honor at each other's weddings. We pinky swore, a blood oath. It felt so monumental back then, when you're 20 and you think promises are unbreakable. I turned the page. Grant's proposal. His assistant, Vivian, took the photo. He was on one knee, right in his office between appointments. I was in jeans and a sale rack blouse. His suit cost more than my car. I told everyone it was spontaneous, that he just couldn't wait. I'd laugh about it. But looking at it then, I finally saw it was just another item on his to-do list, a transaction. On the next page was my mother at the wedding. Your grandmother, Eleanor. She was in a simple blue dress she'd made herself, smiling by the cake, but her eyes. I saw it so clearly in that picture, something I'd missed completely that day. Her eyes looked worried. I suddenly remembered what she'd told me in the church bathroom, right before I walked down the aisle. She fixed my veil and said, "He loves what you give him, Vivian. Make sure he loves who you are." It didn't make sense to me then, but oh, it did now. The last picture was of Delaney's toast. She was in a green dress, holding up a champagne glass, her mascara a little blurry from happy tears. "To my best friend," she'd said, "who deserves the world." Everyone clapped, but in the photo, her eyes weren't on me. They were on Grant, just for a heartbeat, and he was looking right back at her. I closed the album and put it away. I didn't need to see it again. All I needed was to breathe. Just breathe. That's all I could think. I went to the bathroom, turned on the tap, and filled the tub with warm water. Then I climbed in, fully dressed, in my mother's old cardigan, my maternity dress, all of it. I let myself sink until the water was up to my chin, feeling the weight of it soaking through my clothes. I rested my hands on my belly, and you, my little one, you gave a slow, peaceful turn, completely oblivious. "It's just you and me now," I whispered. "You and me." I must have stayed in there for 20 minutes. I didn't cry or scream. I just breathed, listening to the water and feeling the rhythm of your movements. When I finally got out, I dripped water all over Grant's perfect marble floor. I didn't care. I grabbed a towel and walked to the front door, leaving a trail of wet footprints. The doorbell rang. It was a young courier holding a thick legal envelope from a law firm I'd never heard of. Hargrove, Price, and Associates. I signed for the package and closed the door, just standing there, dripping, holding that envelope. Inside was a letter for a Vivian Calloway, the sole surviving heir of Eleanor Hargrove Calloway. Hargrove. That was my mother's maiden name, a name she never, ever spoke about. It wasn't part of any of the stories she told me, not how she met my father, or why she taught piano, or how she raised me in that little Virginia apartment on her small salary and a vegetable garden. The letter was asking me to come for a reading of her complete estate. It was full of words I didn't understand, things like substantial holdings and fiduciary responsibility. My first instinct was to toss it, just another man in a suit trying to manage my life. But that name, Hargrove, it stopped me. It felt important. It felt like a locked door I'd been walking past my whole life, never knowing what was behind it. I put the envelope on the kitchen counter, right next to the divorce papers from Grant. One man wanted to erase me, and my mother, it seemed, had hidden a whole other life from me. I didn't open it right away. It felt like a choice between my pride and our security, my dignity and your future. How could I give up either one? So I just stood there in the kitchen, my wet sweater dripping on the floor, staring at those two envelopes. The prenup that was meant to leave me with nothing had never even been filed. And this letter from my mother's lawyers, it could change everything, but not that night. That night, I was just a 7 months pregnant woman in a puddle, trying to remember how to breathe. I called the law firm the very next morning. My hand was shaking so badly, I could barely dial the number. I was expecting a secretary, a cold, robotic voice you expect from a law office. Instead, a man picked up on the second ring. His voice was warm and calm, the kind that makes you feel like he has all the time in the world just for you. "Malcolm Price," he said. I told him, "This is Vivian Calloway. I got a letter about my mother's estate." There was a little pause, but it wasn't awkward. It felt like he was choosing his words with care, like a doctor about to change your life. "Vivian," he said, "I've been hoping you would call. Your mother spoke of you so often. She was incredibly proud of you." I told him I knew her for over 30 years. He said, "She was a remarkable woman. May I ask, did Eleanor ever happen to mention the Hargrove family to you?" I had to sit down on the edge of the bed. Outside the window, the city was sparkling, so beautiful and so cruel. "No," I said. "My mother was a piano teacher. She lived in a little 2-bedroom apartment in Virginia," I told him. "She drove a 15-year-old car, clipped coupons, and made soup out of vegetable peels. She never, ever he mentioned a Hargrove family." Mr. Price was quiet for a second, and then he said the words that took the world I knew and turned it completely upside down. "Your mother," he said, "was the eldest daughter of Franklin Hargrove, the founder of Hargrove Industrial, one of the biggest private companies in the entire southeastern United States. She walked away from her family when she was 22, changed her name, and married your father. She chose a different life, but she never walked away from her inheritance." I sat down so hard, the room started to spin. "You kicked me then, and for a minute I didn't know if I was dizzy from the news or from you." "I don't understand," I managed to say. He explained that my mother had kept her share of the company in a special trust, one she quietly added to for years. "She also started a foundation," he went on, "for music education in rural areas. Everything was done very quietly. Your mother was probably the most private, wealthy person I've ever known." "How much?" The question felt silly coming out of my mouth, like trying to ask how big the ocean is. "The total estate," he said, "is valued at approximately $4.2 billion. The number didn't even make sense. $4.2 billion. It sounded like a foreign language. The woman who patched my jeans, who taught piano all day to kids who couldn't afford lessons. The woman who cried with relief when I got a scholarship to college so I wouldn't have to worry. $4.2 billion. My first feeling wasn't happiness or relief. It was anger. "She never told me," I said, my voice tight. "My entire life, I worked 2 jobs to get through college. You know, it's funny to think about now, but I was living on hand-me-downs and eating instant noodles 4 times a week. Your grandmother watched me go through it all and never offered a dime. Her lawyer, Malcolm, explained it to me later. She needed me to know my own worth, completely separate from money. She'd seen wealth twist her own family, turning her father and brother into men she didn't recognize. For me, she wanted a foundation that was unbreakable. something that couldn't be bought. She had a plan to tell me everything right after you were born. She'd even written a letter. When Malcolm asked if I wanted him to read it, I just told him to send it. 20 minutes later, I sat down in your nursery to read it. I can still picture the pale yellow walls, the crib I'd painstakingly disassembled, the rocking chair that always squeaked. I opened the email, and there it was. Her cursive, perfect and familiar. The kind she only used for the things that truly mattered. It was the same handwriting from all my birthday cards, school permission slips, even her Thanksgiving shopping lists. My dearest Vivian, it started. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and I am so sorry I never got to tell you myself. She wrote that she left the family name behind because the money made people cold and calculating, like your great-grandfather and great-uncle. She wanted me to understand that my value wasn't a number in a bank account, but the money was mine now, she said, and I should use it to be free and to be good to others. And if anyone tried to make me feel insignificant, I should remember I was never small. I just hadn't realized my own height yet. She signed it. All my love, Mama. I must have read it 3 times, the last time, so slowly, letting every single word sink in. That was the first time I really cried since her funeral. Not that polite, tissue-dabbing crying I did at the cemetery while Grant was on his phone. This was a deep, body-shaking sob. It was the kind of cry that starts deep in your soul and shakes everything, like a wounded animal. I was crying for my mother, for this woman who loved me so much, she let me find my own way, but who also left me everything she had. She picked a simple life over a toxic one and gave me the only gift that fortune can't buy, the certainty of who I was without it. I folded the letter back on its old creases and just held it to my chest, rocking back and forth. It was the same way she used to rock me when I was scared of thunderstorms, and the way I knew I'd soon rock you. I just kept rocking until the tears stopped, and the silence in the room felt warm instead of hollow. It finally hit me. She didn't hide this to hurt me. She kept it a secret because she loved the person I was becoming on my own. And then, you kicked. I let out this messy laugh through the tears. I put my hands on my belly and whispered, "Your grandmother was the most incredible woman who ever lived. And she left us everything. Absolutely everything." I sat in that chair for a long, long time, just rocking and breathing, feeling the staggering weight of $4.2 billion settling on me like a coat I never knew was in the closet. Then, I grabbed my phone and called Malcolm Price back. "Malcolm," I said, "I need this to be kept completely quiet. No press releases, no announcements, and definitely no contact with my husband or his lawyers." He asked why, of course. I told him, because I want to see how people behave when they believe I have absolutely nothing. There was a little pause, and then he gave this quiet, knowing laugh. It was the laugh of a man who suddenly recognized Eleanor Hargrove's daughter. "Your mother," he said, "would be incredibly proud." Grant called that Thursday morning. He was all business, using that same efficient tone he used with the cleaning service. "I need you out by Friday," he said. "I have a guest moving in this weekend." A guest. He didn't even have the guts to say her name. A guest, I thought. He then told me he'd arranged for $12,000 a month in temporary support. He actually called it generous. Coming from a man worth $800 million, the idea was almost comical. It was like a king tossing a single penny to a beggar and expecting a thank you. "Fine," I told him. "I'll be out by Friday." "Good," he said. "I'm glad we can be adults about this." Adults. As if cheating on your pregnant wife right after her mother's funeral was a sign of maturity. After I hung up, I just stood there in the kitchen of that penthouse we'd lived in for 2 years. None of it felt like mine. The furniture, the art, even the view of Central Park. Let him think I'm broken, I thought to myself. Let him think I'm grateful for his table scraps. He had no idea I could buy his whole world and pave it over, but that's not what my mother raised me to be. Your grandmother, Eleanor Calloway, never taught me to tear things down. She taught me how to build things, how to plant a garden, how to play Chopin until the music filled up all the empty, hurting places. When Friday came, I showed up at the penthouse around 10 in the morning with just one suitcase and no idea what to expect. But what I walked into was so much worse than I could have imagined. Delaney was there, and she was wearing my robe, the white silk one your grandmother gave me for Christmas 2 years before. She was sipping coffee from my favorite mug, the blue one with the chipped handle that said, "World's Okayest Mom," a joke gift from a friend at the nonprofit. The sheer nerve of it was stunning. It wasn't just the affair, but the casual way she had taken over my life, standing in my kitchen, in my clothes, with my cup as if I was the one who was just visiting. "Vivi," she said, putting the mug down and coming toward me for a hug, performing that same old best friend routine we'd done 1,000 times. "I am so sorry," she said. "I never wanted this to happen. I know how hard this must be." The words sounded so genuine, the tone so perfect. If I hadn't seen those text messages, I might have actually believed her. I might have cried on her shoulder and never known she was sleeping with my husband and making fun of my baby. "When did it start?" I asked. My voice was completely flat, like ice on a pond. For just a split second, I saw a crack in her perfect facade. "What do you mean?" she asked. 14 months ago, I told her. I read the messages. All the color just washed out of her face, and when it came back, her expression was hard, different. It was like watching someone take off a mask they didn't even know they had on. "Fine," she said, and her voice was suddenly sharp and cold. "If you want the truth, he was never really yours to begin with." She told me they had a connection that I just couldn't understand. "I'm sorry this is how you found out," she said, "but honestly, you should have seen it coming." "I deserved better than this," I said. It wasn't a question or a plea. It was just a simple fact, like saying the sky is blue. I deserved better than both of you. And right on cue, Grant walked in from the bedroom. He'd obviously heard everything. He came into the kitchen with that swagger of a man who owns the whole building. "Let's not make this ugly, Vivian," he said. He used my full name, the way you do when you're trying to put distance between yourself and someone. He stood right beside Delaney, shoulder to shoulder, a united front. My husband and my best friend, standing there in my kitchen, in my robe, telling me not to make a scene. I looked at them for a long moment, really studied them, the way his hand rested on her back, the way she leaned into his touch, both possessive and putting on a show. They already looked like a real couple, and that's what stung the most. It wasn't just that it was over, but that it had been over for so long they'd grown comfortable in their new life together. I packed only one suitcase. I left all the jewelry, the designer outfits, the shoes that cost more than my mom's rent for a month. I left everything Grant had ever bought me because none of it had ever really been mine. I took just 4 things with me: my mother's old cardigan, your first ultrasound picture, her cast iron skillet, and that letter from the estate lawyers. Downstairs, the doorman, Roberto, was standing by the elevator. He'd known me for 2 years, always helped with groceries, told me silly jokes. He looked so sad. "Mrs. Whitmore," he whispered. "You deserve much better," he said. I squeezed his hand and told him, "I know, Roberto. I finally know." As the elevator door shut and the numbers counted down, 27, 26, 25, it felt like I was shedding a layer of my old life with each floor. By the time I got to the lobby, I wasn't Grant Whitmore's wife anymore. I was Vivian Calloway, Eleanor's daughter, and I was done feeling small. I sat in my car in that garage for the longest time without starting it, just resting my hands on the wheel. The baby gave a little kick against my seatbelt. Through the windshield, I saw people going about their day. Couples, a mom with a stroller, an old man with his dog, everyone moving forward. So I did what I always did when my world fell apart. I packed one bag, left behind anything that could be replaced, and took only what was priceless. I started the engine, pulled into traffic, and drove south to Virginia, to my mother's empty apartment, to the only place that felt like home, your grandmother's apartment. It smelled of lavender and lemon polish. I just stood in the doorway and breathed it in. The scent was so powerful, for a second I almost believed she was still there, humming in the kitchen. But the apartment was quiet and still. I stepped inside and shut the door, leaving my suitcase by the entrance. Her navy blue coat was still hanging there, the one with a button missing. Her piano, a simple Baldwin upright, sat by the window. It wasn't fancy, but it had the most beautiful sound. She always used to say that pianos were like people. The prettiest ones aren't always the best. She said the best ones have been played enough to find their own voice. The sheet music for Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major was still open on the stand. It was her favorite. She played it every single evening after dinner. You know, when I was a little girl, the sound of your grandmother's piano would fill our whole apartment. I'd fall asleep to her playing, completely convinced that all the beautiful music in the world came right from her fingertips. I can still picture her reading glasses on the kitchen counter, lying next to a half-done crossword from Tuesday's paper. She was gone the very next day, on a Wednesday. In the quiet that followed, I walked through each room, my hand trailing over every surface. Her favorite book, with its worn-out spine, the tiny pots of herbs on the windowsill, basil, rosemary, thyme, all withered because no one remembered to water them. I found myself opening her drawers, not searching for anything in particular, but just looking. It's strange, honey, how you sift through someone's life after they're gone, hoping to understand who they were in the moments you weren't there. In her closet, I found this old cedar box, its wood polished smooth from years of touch. The latch was stuck, but I managed to pick the lock with one of her hairpins. Inside, I found pictures. But these weren't the kind of photos you'd put in a frame. They were the kind you keep secret. You know, the first time I really understood my mother was when I found an old photograph. There was this young woman in a white dress on the steps of a mansion, beautiful, with dark hair and these eyes that seemed to see everything. It took me a moment to realize it was my mother, Eleanor Hargrove, at maybe 20. Behind her stood my grandfather and uncle, the family she'd left. Beneath it all was a clipping from 1978, naming her a debutante at some fancy ball. My mom, the woman who taught me to make soup from vegetable scraps, had once been a princess in white gloves. A person I never knew. The woman who drove a 15-year-old car had once stood before a palace. The woman who clipped coupons was apparently worth billions. I remember just sitting on her closet floor, holding those pictures to my chest, too numb to even shed a tear. I was in that quiet place beyond crying. As night fell, the apartment got so cold. Your grandmother was frugal to the very end. The thermostat was set to 55. I wrapped myself in every blanket I owned, her quilt, a wool throw, an Afghan her book club made. But the baby was restless, kicking in a way that felt urgent. Then, at 2 in the morning, the contractions began, sharp and fast, like a fist clenching deep inside me. I lay on her bed and tried to remember what the book said. Practice contractions, they called them. Braxton Hicks. Your body just rehearsing. They weren't supposed to be dangerous at 7 months. Not usually. But honey, when you're alone in a cold apartment with no one to call for help, not usually feels a lot like definitely. And definitely feels like the world is about to end. I was so utterly alone. No husband, no best friend, no mother. Just me in a cold apartment full of her things, with a baby trying to arrive 2 months early, and not a soul on earth knew where I was. I dialed the only number I could think of, my OBGYN, Dr. Nadia Harmon. She was the one who'd guided me through everything. The voice that answered was clear and calm. "It's Vivian Calloway," I said. "I'm having contractions. I'm only 7 months." "Okay, Vivian, listen to me," she said. "I need you to breathe." And I did. In for a count of 4, out for a count of 4. The tightness eased. It didn't disappear, but it softened. She told me it sounded like my body was just practicing, that the baby and I were both safe, but that I should come in the next morning to be sure. I whispered thank you and hung up. Lying there on my mother's bed, I stared at the ceiling. I saw a water stain in the corner shaped like a hand, something I'd never noticed in all my years. And I remember thinking, everyone leaves. My father, my husband, my best friend. And now my mother. And what did that leave me with? A baby who didn't yet know what it meant to be left. At 17 minutes past 3 in the morning, I opened my phone. I typed, "Can you survive a divorce while pregnant?" and deleted it. I typed, "How to be a single mother," and deleted that too. Then I just wrote, "I feel so alone," stared at the words, and erased them. I put the phone down and just waited for the sun to come up. And morning always comes, you know. With it came a knock at the door, soft but insistent. I opened it, and there was a woman in her mid-50s with short silver hair and strong hands, holding a grocery bag and a thermos. She wore a flannel shirt and work jeans, mud on her boots. It was Ruby Bennett, my mother's sister-in-law, my aunt. She was the woman who had married my uncle, the one who stayed close to my mom even after he left. She drove up every Thanksgiving to argue about recipes and teach me how to fish. "Aunt Ruby," I said, stunned, "your mama would haunt me if I let you sit in this cold apartment alone," she said, pushing right past me. She set the groceries down, poured 2 cups of coffee, and started cracking eggs into a pan. She didn't ask a single question, didn't say she'd heard about Grant or that anyone had called her. She just cooked, turned up the heat, and opened the curtains. When the omelet was done, she set it in front of me, looked me in the eye, and said, "I know about the money, and I know you're stronger than you think, but right now, you don't have to be. Right now, you just have to eat this omelet." And I did. It was the first real thing I'd eaten in 3 days. It tasted of butter and onions and feeling safe. After that, Ruby told me the whole story, straight and unvarnished, just how she always was. We sat there with more coffee as she laid out the history of the Hargrove family, like she was dealing cards, all of them face up. "Your grandfather, Franklin Hargrove, built an empire from nothing," she said. "Started with a machine shop and ended up with factories in 6 states. He was brilliant and he was ruthless. He used money the way other men use their fists." I listened, and it felt like the baby inside me was listening too. "Your grandmother Alice just stayed," she said. "That's what women did, smiled at parties, took pills to sleep, and never raised her voice. Your Aunt Patricia died young," she said, pausing to take a sip of coffee. "A car accident," the papers said. "But your mother, Eleanor, she was different. Smart and kind, but she was suffocating. Franklin had wanted her to marry a banker's son, a merger disguised as a wedding. Your grandmother said no, and so he cut her off, publicly at a dinner party. Told her she'd be nothing without his name. So she left, I whispered. That very night, Ruby confirmed. 22 years old with just a suitcase and her piano books. Changed her name, got a teaching job, met your father, and had you. Then Ruby leaned in. But here's the thing about your mother, she said. She was gentle, but she was no fool. She never renounced her inheritance. The trust was irrevocable. So all those years, the money just sat there, growing. And you know, Eleanor just let it all grow. She made these quiet, smart investments. Your great-uncle Theodore managed them, a bit reluctantly, I think, because the family trust said he had to. And Eleanor was still family, no matter what Franklin thought. She started a foundation, as Vivian later found out from Malcolm's papers. It was called the Eleanor Callaway Foundation for Music Education in Rural Communities, with a $200 million endowment. She funded the whole thing anonymously. Can you believe it? Nobody knew. All those kids learning piano, the teachers getting new instruments, they had no idea the woman behind it all lived in a simple, 2-bedroom apartment and drove a 15-year-old sedan. Ruby would get this smile on her face, a mix of pride and a little bit of sadness. She was the richest piano teacher in America, she'd say, and the happiest woman I ever knew. Then the doorbell rang, and there was Malcolm Price, tall, thin, graying hair, in a dark suit, holding a leather briefcase that looked like it had seen a thing or two. It looked like it had been part of countless important talks over the years. He took Vivian's hand, in both of his, and held it for just a second too long. You look just like her, was all he said. So they all sat down at the table, Vivian, Ruby, and Malcolm, and he opened that briefcase. The papers were full of dense legal talk and numbers with way too many zeros. But Malcolm, bless his heart, walked her through everything with such patience. The inheritance, the whole picture, laid out in black and white. It was a controlling share in Hargrove Industrial, worth about $2.8 billion. Factories, distribution centers, supply lines all over the Southeast. There were real estate holdings in 6 different states, worth around $900 million. Office buildings, malls, apartments, and land. And an art collection valued at $300 million, with paintings by artists Vivian only knew from museum trips with her mother. Eleanor never once mentioned she owned them. And of course, the Eleanor Callaway Foundation. Its $200 million endowment was funding music programs in 300 schools across 12 states. And there was a trust set up just for Vivian's children that would activate the moment they were born. $4.2 billion in total, all from a woman who patched her own clothes and grew tomatoes on a fire escape. There's one more thing, Malcolm said. Your uncle, Theodore Hargrove, wants to meet you. He and Eleanor hadn't spoken in decades, but he always honored her financial requests. He's 78 now, with no children of his own. You're the last Hargrove. But Vivian just said, so quietly, my mother gave me something worth more than $4 billion. She gave me a life where I learned to be myself without it. Malcolm just nodded, and Ruby squeezed her hand. Then Vivian did something Grant never would have understood, not in a million years. She didn't call a realtor or a private jet company. She called Grant's lawyer, not Grant himself, his lawyer, Douglas Keller. Mr. Keller, she said, I just have one question. Is the prenuptial agreement between Grant Whitmore and Vivian Callaway officially on file with the court? There was this long silence on the other end, then the sound of typing, a drawer opening, papers shuffling. Another long pause. I'll have to get back to you on that, Douglas Keller finally said. But his voice had completely changed. All the confidence was gone, replaced by something that sounded an awful lot like fear. After she hung up, Vivian smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. She didn't need the prenup to be an issue. She had $4.2 billion. But she wanted Grant to feel that fear, just for a moment, to know what it's like when the floor falls out from under you and your strong walls are just paper. She went to her mother's piano and pressed a single key, middle C. The note was so clear and pure. She let it fade away, then pressed it again, a little louder this time. The sound just filled the room, like a voice finally returning after being gone for too long. Those next 2 weeks changed everything. Vivian moved quietly. That was the most important part. No big announcements, no dramatic calls. She just let the legal wheels turn. She let the truth come out the way it always does, a little at a time, and then all at once. She hired Malcolm Price and his firm, and they filed a countersuit in the divorce. They cited adultery, emotional cruelty during her pregnancy, and the fact the prenup was invalid. She asked for half of Grant's estate, not because she needed it or even wanted it, but because she needed him to learn that "she's a nobody" was the most expensive thing he'd ever written. Grant got the papers on a Monday morning. He called her at 11:15. His voice wasn't rehearsed or calm anymore. That perfect mask had finally cracked, and underneath was just pure panic. "What game are you playing?" he yelled. "You were nothing before me." Vivian just held the phone to her ear. She was in Eleanor's kitchen, and Ruby was making cornbread. The whole apartment smelled like butter and home. "I was everything before you," Vivian said. "I just forgot." Then she hung up. Ruby never even looked up from the cornbread, but she had a little smile on her face. The next day, Owen Merritt called. He was Grant's business partner, the man who'd co-founded their real estate firm 8 years earlier. Owen was the practical one, managing projects and budgets, dealing with contractors. Grant was just the face, the name on the door. "Vivian," Owen said. His voice was so careful. "I thought you should know. I've seen some things that worry me. Grant's been hiding assets, moving money to offshore accounts, using company money for personal things. He bought a car last month for someone, not you. He's making bad deals to cover it all up. I'm not comfortable with where this is headed." "Thank you, Owen," she said. "I appreciate you telling me. He's not the man I started this business with," Owen said. "I'm not sure he ever was." She passed that information to her lawyers. It was just another piece of the puzzle, another brick in the wall of truth that was slowly closing in on Grant Whitmore. The big confrontation happened on a Wednesday night. The restaurant was a French place called Margot's. Very expensive, with white tablecloths and a wine list longer than a book. It had been their spot, hers and Grant's, for anniversaries and celebrations. He'd picked the table by the window where he once told her she was the best thing that ever happened to him. It was a deliberate power move on his home turf. And he brought Delaney, another power move. Delaney was wearing a new, huge, cushion-cut diamond engagement ring, showing it off like it was a war medal. But Vivian came in differently. For the first time in weeks, she was rested. Between Ruby's cooking and her mother's quiet apartment, she had found a peace that money couldn't buy. It reminded her of who she was. She wore a simple black dress and her mother's pearl earrings. Nothing from Grant, no designer labels. It was just her. She ordered a sparkling water, sat down, and just waited. Grant, of course, spoke first. "Let's just end this," he said. "Sign the papers, take the apartment, and the $12,000 a month. Be reasonable." "I have a counter-proposal," Vivian said, and her voice was so clear and steady it barely sounded like her own, but her mother would have recognized it. "You give me what I'm legally owed, since there's no valid prenup, and I won't go after the adultery clause." Grant's face turned white, not just pale, but the color of a man who just realized his winning card was never even in the deck. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. "The prenup was never filed. Your lawyer confirmed it." "She's bluffing," Delaney said. way too fast. Vivian finally looked right at Delaney, the woman who was once her best friend, and she saw her clearly, not with anger or hate, but with something far worse. Nothing. "I'm not," Vivian said, "and I never was." That's when Grant completely lost it. His hand slammed down on the table. I remember the way the wine glasses shook on the table. The whole restaurant just fell silent, you know? Every head turned. Our waiter came over. Poor man, he looked terrified. Grant just growled at him. It was a sound I'll never forget. Delaney, bless her heart, tried to grab his arm, her face all tight with fear. Not of me, I realized later, but of him. She was seeing her future right there, the angry, controlling man who treated people like dirt. She was getting a look at the life she'd just signed up for. The waiter brought the bill, and I signed it. My hand was steady as a rock. I just stood up, gave them a little nod, and walked out of that place forever. Things moved fast after that. Grant got some new, hotshot lawyer, the kind that just tries to bury you in paperwork. His mother, Celeste, called me that night. The call lasted maybe 45 seconds. "You will not ruin my son," she said, her voice like ice. Every single word was meant to cut. "Ma'am," I told her, "your son did that all by himself. I'm just here to plant the flowers on the grave." And then I hung up. She called right back, but I didn't pick up. A week later, I went to meet my uncle, Theodore Hargrove. He was the one who'd stayed behind when my mother, Eleanor, left. He'd become exactly what money makes a person, or so Ruby had always said. He lived in this grand old house near Richmond, the kind you see in magazines, with columns and a big circular driveway. It was the same house from that old photo in Mama's cedar box. But the man at the door wasn't some stern patriarch. He was 78 and so thin. The way old folks get when they've had too many meals alone. But his eyes, honey, they were sharp and blue and full of a feeling I knew all too well. Regret. He just looked at my face and started to weep. "You look just like her," he whispered. "My God, you're the spitting image of Eleanor." He invited me in. He showed me the rooms where my mother grew up, the piano she practiced on for hours, the garden where my grandmother Alice grew her roses. He told me stories I'd never heard about how stubborn and fearless she was, always arguing with her father when everyone else was too scared to even breathe. "I should have gone with her," Theodore said, his voice so quiet. "I should have followed her right out that door." But I was a coward. By the time he worked up the nerve, too many years had gone by. He offered me everything. His lawyers, his money, his connections built over 50 years. I said yes, but with my own rules. No publicity, I told him. No power games. I just want to protect my child and build a good life. He nodded, and for the first time, he looked peaceful. "You're more like your mother than you even know," he said. That night, Ruby and I were in Mama's kitchen, making her shrimp and grits. We didn't talk about any of the mess, not Grant or the lawyers or the money. We just talked about her, about Eleanor. Ruby told me stories about Mama sneaking out at 16 to play piano in some blues club, or how she told her father that money without a heart was just paper with dead men's faces on it. She chose love over a legacy, a tough life over a cruel one. She chose a little apartment and an old car and a daughter she could raise right. The kitchen filled up with steam and laughter and the smell of butter and spice. For a little while, it felt like she was right there with us. You know, the funny thing is, Grant's world didn't fall apart because of me. It fell apart because of him. His own partner, Owen Merritt, quietly left him one Thursday. He just cited irreconcilable differences in how they did business. The news didn't make a peep about it, but the investors sure noticed. Without Owen to run things, Grant's projects started to fall apart. A condo building in Brooklyn went $40 million over budget. A hotel in Miami just stopped because he wasn't paying the bills. Then, two of his biggest investors, the old money types, who care more about their name than anything, pulled out after they heard about the divorce. Celeste Whitmore's friends started whispering. In their world, a divorce was one thing, an affair was expected, but to a pregnant wife, right after her mother died, that was a step too far, even for them. Soon, the invitations to all the fancy parties started coming, with only Celeste's name. Grant's was just gone. Delaney, meanwhile, was learning some hard truths of her own. She'd moved into the penthouse I had decorated and filled with life. She slept in the bed I used to make. She used my kitchen, wore a robe I'd left behind. But it wasn't the dream she thought it would be. That big view of the park was lovely, I'm sure, but the apartment itself was cold, not chilly, just empty. The silence was wrong. Grant would come home late, always staring at his phone, and talk to her with that fake warmth I knew so well. He knew all the right words, but none of the feelings behind them. He started watching her phone, asking who she was texting, not because he cared, but because he had to be in control. He'd criticize her clothes, at first subtly, like, "Isn't that dress a little much?" And then down not so subtly, "We have a reputation, Delaney." And after they'd argue, he'd go cold, silent for days, taking away his affection to punish her, to make her feel small. It was the same thing he'd done to me for 23 months. It's a trick that works because it makes you blame yourself, makes you shrink and shrink until you fit into the little box he builds for you. One Tuesday night, around 11:30, Delaney called me, sobbing. "He's not who I thought he was," she cried. "I was sitting in my mother's kitchen. You were sleeping soundly. The little apartment was so warm. Ruby had even fixed the furnace. My cup of tea was still hot on the counter. Outside, you could hear the Virginia crickets. I just listened. I didn't gloat. I didn't say I told you so. I just listened, like you listen to a storm report for a hurricane you've already lived through. I know," I said finally. "I married him." I hung up, finished my tea, and went to bed. I slept the whole night through. The divorce settlement came 3 weeks later. My lawyers laid it all out. The prenup that wasn't valid, the cheating, the cruelty, and the financial mess that Owen had documented. He'd been hiding accounts, diverting company money for himself. The judge listened, and she was on our side. The evidence was all there. Grant's lawyers fought, of course, but it was no use. Legally, I was entitled to half of $800 million. But I did something nobody saw coming. Not Grant, not his lawyers, not even Malcolm at first. I didn't take it. I took what was right for you, my sweet child. A good child support plan, a college fund, health insurance, and a rule that Grant couldn't have custody unless he got therapy. That was it. I didn't take the penthouse, or the cars, or the art. My own lawyer couldn't believe it. "You're walking away from hundreds of millions," he said. But Malcolm, he understood. "She's not punishing him with poverty." He told him. Malcolm once told me Grant was punishing me with irrelevance. Funny, isn't it? I said, "I don't need his money to matter." My own mother taught me that I mattered simply because I existed. The story got out about 2 weeks later, but not because I told anyone. You see, what you do in this world makes more noise than what you hide. The Eleanor Callaway Foundation announced it was expanding 50 new music programs for schools in the South, a brand new music school right in my mother's old neighborhood, and even a prenatal clinic. That last one was funded by a private donor, me. A sharp local reporter put the pieces together, and soon it was in the Richmond paper. Piano teacher's daughter is the Hargrove heiress. After that, the national news grabbed it. It was the kind of tale everyone enjoys, full of secrets and fortunes and betrayal. I heard Grant saw it all on the news. He was in his office, all alone. Owen was gone, the investors had bailed, and Celeste wasn't even taking his calls anymore. They said he just sat there, watching my face on the screen, and his own turned to ash. The look of a man realizing the nobody he'd dismissed was worth 5 times his entire empire. He tried to call me, but I didn't answer. He called Malcolm, and his assistant told him I was, and I quote, permanently unavailable. Delaney saw it too. She was in our old penthouse, wearing my robe, drinking from my mug. I imagine it felt like swallowing a stone, realizing she'd traded a life with a billionaire's wife for being a trophy, for a man who needed control. That big diamond ring he gave her must have suddenly felt awfully heavy. I remember the news anchor couldn't even say Hargrove, right? They kept saying it with a hard G, but I was too busy to correct them. I was putting a crib together for you, my dear, in a new room, in our new life. You decided to arrive on a Sunday morning in October. I woke up at 4:15 to a feeling I'd never had before. It wasn't like the practice contractions I'd felt in that cold little apartment. This was the real thing, deep and sure, the kind of thing that doesn't ask permission. I called Dr. Harmon. Then I called Ruby. Then, in the dark, I got dressed, grabbed the hospital bag I'd had packed for 3 weeks, and drove myself to the hospital. That's just who I was. Your grandmother Ruby showed up 20 minutes later, a beautiful mess, with her pajama top still on under her coat. I broke 3 speed limits, she said, out of breath. Your mama would have broken 4. The labor went on for 11 hours. I didn't scream. I just breathed and counted and squeezed Ruby's hand so tight. I'm pretty sure her knuckles went completely white. Dr. Harmon was just wonderful, so steady and calm, talking me through everything like a pilot landing a plane in a storm. And then, at 3:22 in the afternoon, you were here. 8 pounds, 2 ounces, and you came out screaming. Not crying, sweetheart. Screaming. A furious, full-throated roar that told the whole world I have arrived. They laid you on my chest, so warm and tiny and loud, and I felt something inside me just click into place, as if my entire skeleton had rearranged itself to protect this one little person. Hello, I whispered to you. Hello, Eleanor Ruby Calloway. Your great-grandmother's name, and Ruby's. Names with strength. Ruby was standing right there, tears just pouring down her face, laughing through them. She kept saying, "Oh, Eleanor, your grandmother would have been an absolute wreck right now." Your great-grandfather, Theodore Hargrove, he waited in the hall. He'd driven 3 hours from Richmond holding a bouquet of pink peonies, my mother's favorite. He just stood there, so patiently, the way older men do when they know a moment isn't about them. When I invited him in, he just looked at you for the longest time, and his sharp blue eyes went all soft. She has Eleanor's hands, he said. And he was right. Long, strong fingers, just like a piano player's. As for Grant, my lawyer sent him a standard text. Just the basic information if father is owed. His reply came 30 minutes later. One word, congratulations. I read it, put my phone down, and picked you up. I never wrote back. Owen Merritt sent a lovely handwritten card the very next day. It said, "She's lucky to have you as her mother. Welcome to the world, Eleanor Ruby." I pinned it to your nursery wall, and it stayed there for years. The first 6 months with you, oh my, they were both the fastest and slowest days of my life. A total blur of feedings and changes and waking up in the middle of the night, but every day was a little miracle. We moved into a brownstone in Virginia, not some huge mansion, just a lovely 3-bedroom home with a garden out back. I put my mother's piano by the front window where the afternoon sun would hit it. Your little playmat was on the floor right next to it, and you loved a simple wooden spoon more than any fancy toy. I kept working on the foundation right from the kitchen table. My work was scattered between baby bottles and your little burp cloths. I got the music school opened, funded the clinic, and started a scholarship program for single mothers named after my mom. Everything was named after Eleanor, really. I saw Delaney one Tuesday in a coffee shop that April. I barely recognized her, honey. She'd lost so much weight, and she had this fragile look, with dark circles under her eyes. That beautiful smile of hers looked so brittle. She wasn't wearing his ring. She said my name, Vivian, and her voice just broke. We stood there in a long, heavy silence, with the sounds of the coffee shop all around us. She tried to say something. I could see the words stuck in her throat. Her eyes were brimming with tears. She started, but I gently held up my hand, not in anger, but because we were past all that. I don't need an apology, I told her. I just need you to learn from it. Then I picked up my coffee and walked out, leaving her there. It was like closing the final page of a very long book. Not long after that, Grant's company went under investigation. It wasn't me or Owen. It was one of his own investors who started asking where all the money went. They found everything, the hidden accounts, the missing funds, all the reckless deals. Soon after that, Celeste stopped appearing with him in public. Even his own mother eventually gave up on him. She just stopped defending him, retreated into her townhouse, and filled her days with art and music, basically pretending he didn't exist. So Grant was left rattling around in that penthouse, the one I'd put so much work into decorating. And then Delaney left him too, walked right out of that same apartment after he yelled at her about some bill. She just slipped away in the middle of the night with a single suitcase, like she'd done it before. He'd just sit at that kitchen counter, the same one where he'd served me divorce papers, where that casserole dish had smashed. They replaced the marble, sure, so you couldn't see the damage anymore, but I think he could still feel it. It took me so long to understand that the prison door was never locked. I was my own jailer. I finally got it, sitting in our little Virginia brownstone, with you cooing on a blanket next to me. The cage was never Grant. It was just the silly idea that I needed him. I truly believed I was small without him, that his world was the only one that mattered. My mother, bless her, she understood that. She raised me with nothing, so I'd have to find my own worth. Then she left me billions, so I'd have to figure out what to do with it. Two very different, very precious gifts. I was thinking about all that on a Tuesday evening in October, almost exactly 2 years after he proposed to me between meetings. The light coming in was so warm and golden. You, my little Eleanor, were in your high chair, making a racket with a wooden spoon, just so happy to have discovered rhythm. I was making shrimp and grits, your grandma's recipe, the last one she ever showed me. Her old cast iron skillet, the only thing I took from that penthouse, was sitting on the stove, perfect as ever. Everything sizzled and bubbled, and the kitchen just smelled of home. Then the doorbell chimed, and it was Malcolm Price, smiling on the porch with his briefcase, holding the papers for the final transfer of the trust. It was just the very last signature I needed to give. "Quite a view," he said, looking out at the fireflies starting to blink in the yard. "My mother would have loved it here," I told him. We signed everything right there on the kitchen counter, squeezed between the salt shaker and your sippy cup. $4.2 billion, transferred with a $2 PIN and a signature that took maybe 3 seconds. It was such an ordinary little moment, but it was the most extraordinary of my life. After Malcolm left, I washed the PIN, put it away, and served us dinner. You got your mashed sweet potato absolutely everywhere, and just laughed and laughed. I remember eating so slowly, tasting every single bite. The shrimp was perfect. That old skillet, you see, it felt like it remembered every meal my mom ever made in it and added a little of that love to ours. After, I did the dishes, dried my hands on a plain towel with no fancy initials, and scooped you up for a hug. I can still feel the weight of you on my shoulder, so warm, smelling of baby shampoo and sweet potato and your clean cotton pajamas. I walked us over to the piano and sat down, settling you in my lap. You reached out for the keys with those long fingers you got from your grandma. I pressed middle C, and the note just sang through the house, so clear and pure. It was always the same note, and it always will be. That's the wonderful thing about middle C. It doesn't change or lie or leave. It's always true. You stopped wiggling, and your eyes got so big. So I started to play that Chopin piece, the Nocturne in E-flat major. It was your grandma's favorite. It was the music left open on her piano the day she passed. It was the sound that used to fill her little apartment every evening, something that all the money in the world couldn't create. I played with my eyes shut, the way she taught me, hearing her voice in my head. Feel the keys, Vivian. Don't watch them. Trust your hands. And you know, for the first time, I think I really did. I trusted myself. The music floated out of our little brownstone, through the windows, and into the garden with the fireflies, drifting down the street. It traveled out into that big, complicated, and sometimes unkind world, but a world that also held a sound like that, a piano played with love. That old casserole dish was long gone, shattered and swept away, but the recipe survived. Recipes always do, don't they? Looking back, every part of that story, every little detail, was crafted with a purpose, to teach me something, to lead me here. It's a good reminder that your own story is so important. Thank you for being such a wonderful part of mine. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.